Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, following up on our victory over Lady Maria, we begin with a journey back to the Hunter's Dream to get a special dialogue from the doll. Well, after we wake her up from her weird waking slumber. How are you doing?
Good Hunter, this may sound strange, but have I somehow changed? Moments ago, from some place, perhaps deep within, I sensed a liberation from heavy shackles. Not that I would know. How passing strange.
Strange indeed, and lore-wise, the very existence of this dialogue is significant. The trigger for it, as I mentioned earlier, is the player character defeating Lady Maria. This tie between them, in combination with the resemblance between the boss we fight in the Nightmare and the doll, as well as both NPCs being given the same voice, makes it clear that Lady Maria was the person who served as the basis for the doll. The details of that relationship remain a little unclear, but that there is a connection between them seems almost certain. In terms of translation, then, the most important parts of this message that need to be conveyed come down to the tangible sensation of freedom the doll experienced, and the way that this feeling eludes explanation. In this regard, I think it's clear that the official translation succeeds, but the interesting thing to me is how we're once again seeing several moves away from the literal wording of the Japanese in the process. Take the very first line. Literally, the Japanese has the doll asking in formal language whether we mind being asked a potentially odd question. In the official English, however, this has been changed to a statement, with the character simply letting the player know that the next statement might sound strange. Despite this major rephrasing, though, both lines ultimately serve the same set of purposes. They set up the question that's to follow, and at the same time, let us know that the doll is aware that the question she's about to ask is an unusual one. And we can see the same principle at work in the last two lines as well. Here, the literal Japanese contains a whole additional phrase about how there were never any shackles on the doll to begin with, which the official English covers by using the expression, "not that I would know." Now, at first glance, that might seem like a major change, until you look at the full context of the line and realize that essentially what the doll is expressing with that phrase is that she wouldn't know what it's like to experience liberation from heavy shackles because she's never been in that situation before. It's a rare reversal of the usual way Japanese to English translation works, because here the English actually relies on more implication to convey meaning than the Japanese. But what I really like about this wording is that in using this contextual approach, the actual words the doll says emphasize her bewilderment and lack of familiarity with what's going on, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the key points to be conveyed by this dialogue. It's important that the doll has no explanation for this feeling, not only because she's a doll and has little enough experience with emotions to begin with, but also because she doesn't actually know about Lady Maria or the connection between them. That's something that only the player character is supposed to be able to draw a connection to. So subtly emphasizing this idea with the literal wording of, "not that I would know," seems like a really strong choice to me. Of course, that rewording isn't the only way the official translation strengthens the impression of the doll's bewilderment in the last set of lines. The other thing the English does is reorder part of the doll's dialogue to enhance this effect. In Japanese, the last intelligible line begins with the expression, "fushigi desu ne," which translates straightforwardly into the English phrase, "that's strange, isn't it?" If the translation were to follow suit, though, there would be two problems with the existing wording. First, the phrase, "not that I would know," would stop making sense, because it would be removed from the context by which we can interpret it to mean the same thing as the Japanese. But second, I believe it would also weaken the impression players get of how puzzled the doll is by what's happened, because the dialogue would no longer be ending on an expression of confusion, like, "how passing strange." As it is, though, thanks to the rearranging of the literal order of the Japanese, the effect comes across much the same as in the Japanese subtitles, with the doll expressing wonder at the impossibility of what she just felt. Finally, there's one last thing about the expression "passing strange" that could be worth considering, which has to do with the age of that particular wording. In the real world, its most famous early usage comes from Shakespeare, and seems to have resulted from the shortening of the word surpassing to passing. This might be significant because it fits with the concept that Maria, and by extension the doll, is an old hunter of a bygone era. So it's possible the translators went with this particular phrase to help bring out that old-timey feel in the doll's speech. Whether that one small detail is meant to be significant or not, though, if you consider this dialogue as a whole, I think it stands as one of the best examples we've seen so far of how important it is in translation to stay true to the core meaning and narrative purpose of a given set of lines without being bound too closely to the literal wording. But as longtime viewers know, there are plenty of other challenges in translation, one great example of which we can see on this next item. Astrological plate. Observational plate that forms a pair with the Grand Cathedral's giant astrological clock. If the astrological plate is held aloft facing the astrological clock, that will begin to move once more. And it will be a guide, likely letting slip a secret to an observer. Incidentally, I have a secret to let slip as well, which is that it's much more dangerous to display item descriptions in the Chalice Dungeons than it is in the main game. Setting that aside though, the translation challenge I think this item best illustrates is that of coming up with appropriate names for unique fictional objects. Admittedly, this can sometimes be a simple and straightforward task. I doubt anyone's going to be racking their brains trying to reinvent a translation for the common gaming term potion very often. Also, sometimes the weirdness of an item name comes from the way it combines existing concepts. The eye pendant makes for a good example of this, since it's literally the word for eye modifying the word for pendant in Japanese. However, with this particular key item, one of the things that makes it hard to translate is that not only is there nothing exactly like it in the real world, but the very concept of what it is ties in with how Bloodborne's world works. So in a sense, the translators are being asked to come up with the name for a whole category of fictional devices. Thankfully though, it's not as if they have nothing to go on. While I've said before that I doubt the translators had access to visual information when working on the text, there's enough written details that I think we can recreate what some of their considerations might have been. First of all, as I mentioned in the previous episode, the word hoshimi has both a literal meaning of gazing at the stars and a connotation of fortune-telling, while the final kanji, ban, is often used to represent round, flat objects. If you put together the concepts of stargazing and a round, flat shape, it's not hard to arrive at the idea that this might be describing a planisphere, one of those round sets of star charts used to help recognize stars and constellations. Of course, it's not a direct reference. The term for planisphere in Japanese is seiza hayamiban, which literally translates to something like constellation quick-find board. Still, considered in light of what I believe to be the lack of visual reference from the game itself, I think you can see how this parallel would be an important piece in puzzling out what the device in Bloodborne is meant to do. The other big puzzle pieces come from the item description itself, where first we learn that this item is meant to form a pair with the Astral Clock, and then notably we see it referred to as a kansokuban, or observational plate. This is another made-up term, but it's even easier to follow than the one used for the item name, because it uses the word for observation in combination with that same term for round, flat things. It reinforces the idea that we got from the real-world reference that this is a disc-shaped tool meant to be used in conjunction with the Astral Clock to interpret the meaning of the world by gazing up at the heavens. Now that we have some idea of what this thing is, though, that brings us to the question of what the appropriate name for such a device would be. Obviously, the translators settled on Celestial Dial, which I would say works, but that actually raises a question of its own. That's because, as you may have noticed, in Japanese, both the clock and this disc are described using the same word, hoshimi, which I've literally been translating as astrological. So why not call this the Astral Dial to match the naming of the Astral Clock? That would allow the English to recreate the repetitive naming scheme and still emphasize the themes of both astronomical observation and astrological significance. Well, I can't speak to the translator's exact thought process, but I can say what my reasons would be for preferring an alternative term. First of all, there's simply something to be said for stylistic variation in its own right. As I've mentioned before, Japanese language writing tends to be more tolerant of straight-up repetition than is considered to be good style in English. Second, if part of the point of the name is to make players think of planispheres, I think the word astral is too vague and potentially spiritual. It might work well enough for a clock tower, since the real-world reference in the latter term is unmistakable, but with a more general term like disc, plate, or dial, I don't think that connection is clear enough. Finally, recall that this item is also referred to in Japanese as an observational plate, which seems more focused on the specific than something like the star-interpreting clock. For these same reasons, I think Celestial is a strong choice. It provides some variation from Astral while still fitting into the same category. it strikes me as more likely to bring real-world astronomical tools to mind for players, and in referring directly to the heavens, it fits in with the practice of observation. As for the word dial, I like it not only as a natural-sounding way to get at the idea of a round, flat object, but also because that same word can be used to refer to the front or face of a watch or clock. For me, this helps strengthen the tie between the larger timepiece used for interpreting the stars and the smaller observational tool meant to be used for similar purposes alongside it. Though admittedly, the way we use it in this cutscene in the Nightmare doesn't make a lot of literal sense. Still, I don't think that should impact our understanding of this device and its name too much. One way or another, it would have been a challenge to first identify the concept behind the celestial dial and then convey that in words, and I'd say the translators rose to the occasion. As we advance into the unusual landscape that awaits us outside, though, I want to briefly point out one last surprising detail at the end of this item description. For the most part, the idea of the clock moving or coming to life again to reveal a secret, presumably the one we killed Maria to pursue, is something that comes across well in both languages, except where the official English refers to a curious interloper, while the Japanese speaks of an observer. It's a comparatively minor change, but even so, I wonder if this is another example of an update on the Japanese end of things, perhaps when the more interactive version of the Maria fight was cut, that didn't get carried through to the English. That could explain the more accusatory tone, much like we hear from this guy.
Black and white, blasphemous murders, blood-crazed fiends. Atonement for the wretches, by the wrath of Mother Goss. Mercy for the poor wizened child. Mercy. Oh, please.
Sorry, what are you talking about?
Atonement for the wretches. Lay the curse of blood upon them, and their children, and their children's children forevermore. Each wretched birth will plunge each child into a lifetime of misery.
That's quite the curse. Don't you have any mercy?
Mercy for the poor wizened child. Let the pungence of Cos cling like a mother's devotion.
I don't know, that sounds pretty gross to me. More importantly though, these lines are deeply cryptic and vague, two qualities that point us towards the narrative function of these dialogues that I want to keep in mind while analyzing their translation. The whole point of these lines is to confront the player with the tantalizing amount of information that they don't have the tools to fully make sense of. To do so, they partially express some deep truths, but in typical Bloodborne fashion, they sound like madness. As such, the translation must similarly appear to be rich with meaning while revealing relatively little. This goal is facilitated to some extent by the ambiguous nature of the Japanese, but there are also plenty of ways the translators have worked to keep the same effect going while also sounding natural in English. For instance, take a look at the third and fourth lines of the translation. These actually correspond to a single line of the Japanese, though it's made up of two incomplete sentences. Neither of these two fragments actually contain a verb, and only the first of them specifies who it's directed at, but by implication, we can understand that the speaker is calling for retribution on a group of people he dislikes, as well as wishing the wrath of Kaz upon them. However, given the way these two statements are presented as part of the same line of text, it also seems like the latter statement is either a restatement of the first idea, or at least bound up with it. That is, there's an implication that Mother Goss's anger might be the retribution the speaker is calling for, or at least it's likely related to that retribution. So how can the translators preserve that connection? Well, they can recast the sentences a bit so that the wrath of Mother Goss becomes the instrument by which the wretches are made to atone. Now, this does introduce a potential change to the text, since the Japanese never outright specifies that Goss's anger is the mechanism by which the retribution is to be exacted, but I don't see this as a huge problem. Remember, based on what we know of curses in Bloodborne, which involve verbally directing the stirred-up wrath of the Great Ones via some sort of rite involving the loss of a child, this is exactly how we would expect things to work. And since the Japanese is broad enough to accommodate this interpretation, I think it's fair to say the official translation has appropriately captured the spirit of the line. While that particular bit of dialogue introduces some clarity into the text, though, there are other ways in which the translation makes things seem even more ambiguous. To see this, we can turn to the second and third English lines of the dialogue where the speaker outlines what the curse will entail. Once again, all this information is contained in a single line of the Japanese, and once again, it's not entirely clear how to interpret the text in question. Literally, the villager calls for the blood of the people he finds offensive to be cursed, but it's hard to say if this is meant to be taken as an actual curse on their blood, or if this is a figurative way of referring to their bloodlines. If the second half of the line were presented on its own, it might seem more like the blood interpretation was correct, but instead, this comes after what's literally an echo of the first thing we hear upon entering the nightmare, which is a desire that the curse continue even unto the last generation of its recipients, leaving things unclear. It could even be a call for both, with the cursed blood deliberately being meant to persist through the various bloodlines. So how does the official English deal with this level of ambiguity? It takes things even further by creating the idea of the curse of blood. Like the Japanese, this phrase could be interpreted as referring to a curse specifically on the blood of its recipients, and while it's a bit harder for me to see this being purely a generational curse based on that phrase, it opens up a number of other possibilities. For instance, it could refer to one of a number of known curses. That is, the curse of blood might be contrasted with the curse of fire or something. Alternatively, this could be seen as cursing people with blood, providing them with the means of their own destruction. True, not all of these ideas fit neatly into my own understanding of Bloodborne's lore, but as far as I'm concerned, the important thing is to maintain the air of uncertainty. After all, that's one of the key roles this set of dialogues is meant to serve. The point is for players to hear, "Lay the curse of blood upon them," realize that this must be significant, but be left unsure of what exactly that significance is. To my mind, the official translation accomplishes that and is therefore successful. That brings us to the final short dialogue, which I find the most cryptic of all. In particular, the way the last line of the Japanese expresses the speaker's desire that Gossa's rotten smell, which may or may not be equivalent to a mother's devotion, be delivered at last, leaves me puzzled. Yes, I understand all those words, and I can speculate on their meaning based on future events, but I'm still not entirely sure what they mean. Fittingly enough, the last line of the official English is equally vague. The translation concludes with the wish that the pungence, or sharply offensive smell, of cause cling like a mother's devotion. In terms of literal meaning then, the one big shift is that there's no talk of a final arrival. But it's difficult to evaluate the importance of that change without knowing the intended meaning behind the expression. If it's referring to the situation we'll find the wizened child in, the official English seems perfectly appropriate. If not, who knows? What I can say for sure, though, is that this is another case where the translators have achieved what I believe is this dialogue's narrative purpose. It's another phrase that sounds significant, almost makes sense, but that ultimately eludes me. On the whole, then, I'd say all three of these dialogues have done their jobs. I will leave you with that thought, but know that if you'd like to share any of yours, I would love to hear from you. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.